The twin suns of Arden hung low in the violet sky, their light spilling across the fields of grain that shimmered like liquid gold. For generations, the human settlement at Dawnspire had lived quietly, almost forgotten on the fringes of colonized space. Its people were not warriors or politicians but farmers, miners, and artisans who believed that distance from the great empires meant safety. Children played along irrigation canals carved by their ancestors, and elders told stories of Earth that few still remembered. Among them was Kalen Dross, a young man whose hands bore both the calluses of labor and the precision of a mechanic. He was neither the strongest nor the oldest, but in his eyes there burned a restless spark, the kind that often precedes either greatness or ruin. Dawnspire's heart was its people, and each of them carried a role that bound the village into something greater than its parts. Elder Mareth, bent and frail, was the keeper of memory, her voice steady even when her body faltered. Celine, Kalen's closest friend, was a healer whose laughter could calm children during storms and whose quiet resolve hid an iron will. Tuvin, a miner scarred from years in the deep tunnels, had seen enough hardship to recognize danger before others did. They were not extraordinary individuals by the measure of great empires, but together they formed a fragile tapestry of survival, one that held against the indifference of the galaxy. That illusion of peace shattered the night the sky burned. At first, it was mistaken for a storm, the villagers gathering outside to watch the heavens streak with fire. But when the streak slowed, when the thunder became a rhythm of engines, realization spread like ice in their veins. Ships, sleek, angular, and marked with the sigils of the Care Dominion, descended. The Dominion had long been whispered about in hushed tones, a civilization that stretched across hundreds of systems, its arrogance matched only by its appetite for conquest. To them, Dawnspire was not a community of souls, but an infestation on a world they now claimed as theirs. The first blasts tore apart the outer fields. Crops vanished in a flash of white fire, the land left smoking and bare. Children screamed, herded toward cellars that offered no true protection. Kalen found himself pulling Celine behind a shattered wall as plasma streaks cut through the air, his heart slamming against his ribs. The invaders did not speak or demand surrender. They came with the cold efficiency of exterminators, their weapons sweeping across homes as though the people within were nothing more than vermin. Tuvin tried to fight, wielding an old mining charge against a patrol that had cornered fleeing villagers. The explosion destroyed 3 of the armored figures, but cost him his life, his sacrifice buying only seconds. Kalen remembered the elder's voice crying out, remembered Celine's hands pressed to a child's wound as the world collapsed around them. Dawnspire's defenders were not soldiers. They had no fleets or armies, no trained fighters. They had only desperation, and desperation was not enough. By dawn, the village lay in ruin. Smoke coiled upward, drifting across the scorched horizon. The Dominion forces withdrew as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving wreckage behind them as if to say the humans were too insignificant for occupation. What they had not realized was that in their indifference they had left survivors, shattered, grieving, but alive. Kalen stood amid the ashes of his home, fists clenched so tightly his nails cut into his palms. Around him, the remnants of the village gathered. Children wept for parents they would never see again. Celine's face was streaked with soot and tears, but her hands still moved with steady purpose as she bound wounds. Elder Mareth's voice trembled as she whispered a prayer for the dead, her words barely audible above the crackle of still-burning timbers. Every soul bore the same hollow look, a wound deeper than flesh, a question that burned without answer. Why them? Why here? Why like this? It was then, as silence settled over the devastation, that Kalen felt something hard beneath his boot. He looked down and pulled free a shard of alien tech, torn from one of the fallen Dominion soldiers. It pulsed faintly, humming with power he could not understand. Tuvin's sacrifice, Mareth's grief, Celine's bloodied hands, all of it seemed to converge into that single moment of clarity. They had been marked for erasure, but erasure had failed. The survivors gathered in the ruined square where the council hall once stood, their faces lit by the faint glow of smoldering embers. Kalen raised the shard high, its alien light flickering against the night. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of what he carried. He told them that survival was no longer enough, that to remain passive was to await another slaughter. The Dominion believed them too small to matter, too fragile to fight back. That belief would become their blind spot. Celine stepped beside him, her eyes fierce though her hands still trembled. "If they could burn us so easily," she said, "then we can make them bleed just as easily. We are still here. That is their mistake." Elder Mareth, who had lived long enough to bury friends and children alike, nodded slowly, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. "Then let us show them what remains when they try to erase a people." The decision did not come from strategy or training, but from pain transformed into purpose. The village that had been left to die now breathed with a new, grim resolve. In the quiet that followed, Kalen understood what the shard in his hand truly represented. Not just a weapon, not just alien power, but proof that the Dominion was not untouchable. The ruins of Dawn Spire still smoldered, yet within them, something unexpected had taken root. Vengeance was not enough. What they sought was justice. And though none of them knew how to wage war against an empire, the path had already been chosen. What began as survival would grow into something far greater, something that would carry them from the ashes of a forgotten village to the very heart of the Dominion itself. The night closed in around them, heavy with grief, yet sharpened by resolve. For the first time since the ships had arrived, Kalen lifted his head toward the stars not with fear, but with intent. What the Dominion had tried to wipe away would rise again, and the echoes of their mistake would carry far beyond this small, broken world. The weeks after the fall of Dawn Spire blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion and necessity. Survival alone would have been challenge enough, yet the survivors carried more than grief. They carried a vow. Kalen emerged as the reluctant center of their resolve, not because he sought command but because others instinctively turned to him. He worked without pause, his hands covered in burns from dismantling alien debris, his voice hoarse from urging others to keep moving when despair threatened to smother them. Celine became his anchor, tending to wounds that never fully healed and reminding him, with quiet determination, that vengeance without purpose was nothing but destruction. Elder Mareth's wisdom stitched the group together, grounding their fury and patience, while even the children contributed by scavenging parts from the wreckage. What had once been a peaceful village began to reshape itself into something sharper, harder, forged by necessity. The Dominion had underestimated the strength of memory. Every survivor remembered the faces of those lost, the screams in the night, the sight of flames swallowing their homes. Each remembered detail became fuel, and with fuel came invention. Kalen discovered that the shard he had salvaged was a fragment of a Dominion interface node, a kind of key that could manipulate their systems. He studied it feverishly, dismantling it piece by piece until its secrets unfolded. What he learned was dangerous, but invaluable. The Dominion's technology, though powerful, relied on uniform codes that, once broken, could be turned against them. For the first time, the villagers had more than grief, they had leverage. Their first act of resistance was not planned as a grand rebellion, but as a desperate strike for survival. With Tuvin gone, his fellow miners used their knowledge of explosives to craft crude weapons from fuel cells and pressure valves. Kalen and Celine led a small group to intercept a Dominion patrol that had returned to harvest resources from the valley. What began as a risky ambush ended in victory. They crippled the patrol's skimmer, scavenged its weapons, and, most importantly, captured a tactical display unit. The exhilaration of that moment transformed them. For the first time since the attack, they were not prey, they were predators. Word spread beyond Dawn Spire's ruins. Other settlements on Arden, long oppressed by Dominion overseers, sent envoys in secret. Farmers from the northern plains, miners from the Iron Ridges, and even nomadic tribes from the deserts came to listen. They all shared the same story. Burned fields, vanished families, the weight of living under an empire that saw them as nothing more than dust beneath its heel. Kalen stood before them, Not as a polished general, but as a man scarred by loss, his voice unpolished, yet resonant with conviction. "We are not soldiers," he told them, "but neither are we helpless. If a village can rise, so can a world." With each alliance, their strength grew. The Dominion responded with harsher measures, deploying squads to root out resistance, but the humans had learned the art of shadows. They struck supply lines under cover of night, sabotaged communication relays, and turned Dominion arrogance into their greatest advantage. Celine's role deepened beyond healing. She became a strategist, her empathy enabling her to anticipate not only the needs of their people, but the blind spots of their enemies. Elder Mareth counseled restraint, reminding them that to replace one cruelty with another would be to lose the very soul of their cause. Yet even she, who had once preached peace, began to see that war had been forced upon them. The turning point came with the assault on the outpost of Vera. The Dominion had fortified it to guard a key supply route, believing no group of villagers could threaten such a stronghold. Armed with scavenged rifles, stolen energy cells, and their patchwork ingenuity, the resistance infiltrated through the forgotten sewer tunnels beneath the walls. Kalen led the charge, his breath steady despite the weight of fear, while Celine coordinated the diversion that drew soldiers away from the gates. The battle was fierce, chaotic, but by dawn the Dominion banner had fallen, and the outpost belonged to the survivors. For the first time, a symbol of Dominion dominance had been turned against them. Victory brought with it a new kind of burden. With the fall of Vera, the resistance was no longer invisible. They had declared themselves to the Dominion, and the Empire would not ignore them again. Yet the triumph also drew others to their side, fugitives, exiles, and even disillusioned alien defectors who had suffered under the Dominion's tyranny. What had begun as a village's desperate retaliation had become a movement, a swelling tide that could no longer be dismissed as a nuisance. Kalen wrestled with the weight of leadership, his nights haunted by the faces of those he could not save, but Celine's steady presence reminded him that hesitation was costlier than action. The Dominion retaliated with fire, sending fleets to scour the regions where resistance stirred. Villages burned again, but this time the survivors fled not into silence, but into the arms of the growing rebellion. The humans had become hunters of opportunity, striking hard and vanishing into the forests and tunnels before the enemy could rally. Each encounter honed them further, teaching them discipline born of necessity. Kalen found himself staring at the faces of new recruits and realizing with both pride and dread that the village's fight was no longer theirs alone. It had become the war of a people. Yet for all their victories, doubts gnawed at the edges of their resolve. Elder Mareth warned that the Dominion's pride, once wounded, would lash back with greater fury. Celine reminded Kalen that each battle claimed lives they could scarcely afford to lose. The weight of command pressed upon him, not in the form of orders or strategies, but in the quiet moments when he saw the fear in the eyes of children who looked to him for safety. He had never asked for this role, but destiny rarely asked permission. When scouts returned with word of the Dominion's capital fleet massing far beyond Arden, the survivors faced a truth that silenced even their most defiant voices. The Empire would not stop until their rebellion was extinguished. To fight on was to accept annihilation, yet to surrender was to erase everything they had endured. It was in this moment of grim reckoning that Kalen spoke words that would carry beyond the ruined fields of Dawnspire. We were meant to be erased. Instead, we endure. And if endurance is all we have, then we will make it their undoing. The declaration spread like fire through the ranks, igniting both fear and hope in equal measure. The rebellion, once a fractured coalition of survivors, now looked toward a single impossible goal, not merely to resist but to strike at the very heart of the Dominion. The shard in Kalen's possession, once a fragment of ruin, had become their key to a larger war. And though none of them could see how such a path might end, the choice was no longer theirs to debate. The road forward led only toward the Empire's capital, and already the first steps had been taken. The journey to the Dominion's capital began not with triumph, but with silence. In the wake of countless raids and skirmishes, the rebellion had grown into an army, Yet every victory carried the weight of lives spent like coin. Kaelin stood aboard the largest of their captured warships, its hull still scarred with Dominion insignia, staring at the star charts glowing across the command deck. The capital lay at the center of it all, a glittering nexus of power, defended by fleets that had never known defeat. To strike there was madness, and yet madness had become their only path. The memory of Dawnspire still smoldered in his chest, not as grief alone, but as a blade honed sharp. Celine stood at his side, her eyes fixed on the map, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "They think us incapable of reaching them," she murmured. "That arrogance will be the doorway we walk through." The infiltration plan was stitched together with equal parts desperation and brilliance. Using the shard Kaelin had carried since the night of the village's destruction, their engineers devised a way to mimic Dominion signals. Disguised within a supply convoy, their fleet threaded the outer defenses, slipping through layers of scanning nets and patrol lines that would have annihilated them in open battle. Every breath on the command deck was held taut, every flicker of a sensor a threat to unravel the ruse. When at last the sprawling world of Kareth loomed before them, its sky pierced by spires of crystal and steel, its orbit swarmed by battleships, the weight of what they attempted pressed down like gravity. The first clash came swift and brutal. A Dominion patrol challenged their codes, suspicion slicing through the disguise. Kaelin ordered the attack before hesitation could betray them. The rebellion's ships erupted from the convoy like teeth bared in sudden defiance, cannons firing, fighters swarming. Explosions stitched fire across the void, the battle spilling into the capital's orbit. What they lacked in numbers they compensated with audacity, striking hard at weak points the Dominion had never expected to defend. Celine coordinated from the command deck, her voice steady as she directed waves of fighters to dismantle shield relays and blind the massive orbital cannons. For every ship lost, 2 more pressed forward, not because they believed survival was assured, but because retreat was no longer an option. On the surface, chaos bloomed. The rebellion landed troops in the industrial districts, seizing power stations and cutting supply lines. Ordinary citizens, long cowed by the Dominion's rule, watched in shock as humans from the frontier, those the Empire had dismissed as nothing, stormed the streets. Some joined, emboldened by the sight of an empire bleeding. Others cowered, uncertain of what vengeance might follow. Kaelin moved among the landing parties, his presence a rallying flame. To him, every step into the capital's heart was another echo of Dawnspire's ashes answering back across the stars. The final push led them to the High Citadel, the nerve center of Dominion rule. Its towers shimmered like blades against the sky, guarded by soldiers whose loyalty had been carved into them since birth. Within its halls, Kaelin confronted the figure who had ordered the purging of Dawnspire, a warlord cloaked in silver armor, eyes burning with disdain. Their clash was not merely steel against steel, but grief against arrogance, the weight of memory against the certainty of supremacy. Each strike Kaelin delivered carried the names of the dead, each parry fueled by the belief that survival alone was victory. The warlord mocked him, declaring that one village could not stand against centuries of empire. Kaelin answered not with words, but with the final blow that felled him, proof that even the smallest flame could consume a forest. As the Citadel's defenses crumbled, Celine led the charge into the central command chamber, where the shard was placed into the Dominion's core system. What had once been a tool of oppression now became the key to collapse. Lights flickered, alarms screamed, and the vast network that bound the Empire together faltered. Ships lost contact, soldiers hesitated without orders, and the great machine of Dominion fractured under its own weight. For the first time in living memory, the Empire trembled. Yet victory was not without cost. The halls of the Citadel were littered with the fallen, many of them faces Kaelin knew, lives he had sworn to protect. Elder Mareth did not live to see the Citadel fall, her final counsel whispered in his memory as he looked upon the ruins of the enemy's throne. Celine's hands shook as she deactivated the last of the Dominion's command protocols, her voice hoarse as she whispered, "It's over." But Kaelin knew it was not over. Not truly. Toppling a capital was not the same as building a future. The scars of war ran deep, and the question of what would rise in the Dominion's place loomed larger than the fires burning across Caritha's skyline. Still, the moment could not be denied. The village they had tried to erase now stood at the heart of an empire, its survivors no longer forgotten dust, but the authors of a new chapter in human history. Kalen looked out over the capital from the shattered windows of the citadel, the horizon bathed in smoke and dawnlight. He felt the weight of every life lost and every choice made pressing down upon him, but within that weight was also the certainty that the Dominion's age was broken. The rebellion had begun with ashes and ended with a crown torn from an empire's head. Yet as the fires burned and the people of Carith raised their eyes to the invaders who had become liberators, Kalen whispered a vow to himself. This victory would not become another tyranny. The village had not survived to trade one master for another. Their struggle was not simply to own the capital, but to build a world where no village would ever again fear erasure. In that vow lay the next chapter, unwritten but inevitable. The stars stretched beyond the capital, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of powers, and within them awaited challenges far greater than the Dominion. But for this moment, in the ruins of a fallen empire, the survivors of Dawnspire stood victorious, proof that even the smallest voices, when joined together, could shake the very foundations of the galaxy.